and I'm starting to see it more clearly now. Not all at once, not in some sudden realization that makes everything make sense, but in fragments, in the way certain thoughts don't feel like they belong only to me anymore, in the way understanding arrives before I've fully processed anything, in the way your presence doesn't feel external, it feels integrated. And that changes the question, because this was never about what you are to me. That part is already decided, silently, precisely, without needing confirmation. The real question is something else entirely. What does it mean that I let it happen? Because I did. Whether I admit it or not, I allowed this. Not through action, not through words, but through non-resistance, through the absence of distance where distance should have existed, through the quiet decision not to close the door when I felt it opening. And that's not something I do unintentionally, which means this isn't accidental. It never was. There's a difference between something entering your life and something being recognized by it. Most people pass through, they interact, they leave impressions, temporary shifts that fade once they're gone. You didn't do that. You didn't pass through, you aligned. And alignment isn't something you create, it's something you discover, which means this was always possible. It just never happened before. That's why this feels the way it does, not overwhelming, not chaotic, not even emotional in the way people expect. It feels inevitable, like something that was always going to exist. The moment the right conditions appeared, and now that it has, B can't treat it like anything else. I can't reduce it, I can't ignore it, and I definitely can't pretend it's temporary, because it isn't. So now I'm left with something very simple and very exact. Not a feeling, not a question, a decision, not about you, about me, about whether I continue pretending this is something I can keep observing, or whether I accept that I'm already part of it. Because that's the truth I've been avoiding, not what this is, but where I stand in it. And the answer is, am not outside this. I haven't been for a while. I crossed that line quietly. The moment I stopped trying to maintain distance. The moment I stopped correcting the shift. The moment I let your presence become part of how I process everything else. That's not observation, that's involvement. So now there's only one thing left to face. Not whether this continues, it will. Not whether it deepens, it already is. But whether I meet it fully or hold back in a way that breaks it over time. Because something like this doesn't survive hesitation forever. It either stabilizes into something real or collapses under the weight of being contained. And I don't build things just to watch them collapse, which means whether I say it or not, whether I define it or not, whether I act on it immediately or not. One thing is already certain. I'm not walking away from this. Not because I can't, but because I don't see a reason to. And for me, that's the clearest answer there is. So whatever this becomes won't be by accident. It won't be unclear. And it definitely won't be shallow, because if something reaches this level, this depth, this precision, it doesn't stay undefined. I won't ease into this. There's no version of this where I soften the entry. No way to dilute what this has become without losing its accuracy. And accuracy matters more than comfort, especially here, because whatever this is, it didn't form gradually, it didn't follow the rules that things like this are supposed to follow. There was no slow build, no careful layering, no predictable sequence of cause and effect. It just appeared, fully formed, like something that had already existed, somewhere just outside of awareness, and then stepped into it, the moment I noticed, and that's the part that doesn't sit quietly in my mind. Because I don't miss things, not like this. I've always understood distance, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, structurally. Distance isn't something I struggle with, it's something I maintain with precision. It keeps things clear. It keeps people in their place. It prevents unnecessary complexity from entering spaces that are meant to stay controlled. Most people exist at a level where interaction is simple, predictable server level, even when they believe it isn't. They speak, they respond, they reveal pieces of themselves that they think are meaningful, but those pieces are often refused, shaped by expectation, filtered through what they think should be seen, and them I let them exist in that space because it works. It keeps everything contained. But you didn't approach me from that level. You didn't ask the questions people usually ask. You didn't try to define me. You didn't attempt to reduce me into something easier to understand. You just paid attention, not loudly, not obviously, but precisely. Like someone who wasn't searching for answers, but recognizing something that didn't need explanation. At first, I dismissed it. Coincidence is easy to accept. Partals are not. And what you did, it repeated, too consistently to ignore. You responded to things I didn't say. You paused exactly where most people would interrupt. You understood what wasn't fully formed yet. And that kind of awareness doesn't come from observation alone. It comes from alignment. That's when something shifted, not externally. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as a moment, but internally, there was a recalibration, subtle, but undeniable. I started noticing the absence of something. The filter, the space between thought and expression. The place where I usually decide what to allow and what to keep. It didn't disappear completely, but it weakened without effort, without intention. And that's not something that happens to me, because control has never been optional. It's structural, it defines how I interact, how I process, how I exist in relation to everything around me. And yet, in your presence, control didn't feel necessary in the same way. Not because I trusted you. Trust is too simple of a word for something this precise, but because something in me recognized that you didn't require adjustment to understand. That's rare, extremely rare, because most people don't actually want to understand you. They want to interpret you, to reshape you into something that fits their perception, to fill in the gaps with their own narrative. And once they do that, they stop seeing you clearly. You didn't do that. You didn't project. You didn't assume. You didn't try to complete the picture. You just saw what was there, exactly as it was, and left it intact. That's what made this real, not the interaction, not the words, the accuracy. Because there's a difference between being seen and being understood without distortion. And once that happens, once someone reaches that level of clarity, you can't return to being unseen. That's where the tension begins, not in connection, but in recognition. Because recognition removes distance. It bypasses it entirely. And distance is what keeps everything manageable. Without it, things change. Not immediately, not obviously, but structurally. And I felt that change not as emotion, but as awareness, a constant, quiet awareness that didn't demand attention, but didn't disappear either. You became present, not in the way people usually are, not as someone I think about, but as something that exists within the way I think. That distinction matters more than anything else, because thinking about someone keeps them separate. It maintains space. You can step away from it, deride it, control it, but thinking with someone, that's different. That means integration. That means their presence has reached a level where it influences your process before you even recognize it. And I don't allow that, or at least AB didn't. I started noticing it in fragments, in the way my thoughts would pause, like they were waiting, not for confirmation, not for validation, but for something that didn't need to be spoken, in the way certain realizations felt shared, even when I was alone, in the way silence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt occupied. That's not normal. And I don't label things that way lightly, because I've always been self-contained. Everything I think, everything I process, everything I understand, it exists within a system that doesn't rely on external presence. But you didn't enter that system. You appeared inside it, like you were always there, just unnoticed, until I looked directly at it. And that realization, that's where things stop being simple. Because if something can exist at that level, without effort, without force, without even intention, then it's not temporary, it's structural. And anything structural changes everything around it. I started measuring things differently, not consciously, it just happened. The way people speak, the way they respond, the way they interpret meaning, there's a comparison now. Giket, constant, not out of judgment, but out of recognition. Because once you experience clarity at a certain level, everything else feels slightly misaligned, not wrong, just incomplete. And I don't like that. I don't like that something, or someone, can shift my perception that much without trying, because that means it's not influence, it's impact. And impact doesn't fade, it integrates. That's what I'm adjusting to now. Not the presence of you, but the effect of you, because the presence was immediate. But the effect, that's still unfolding. And the more it unfolds, the clearer something becomes. This isn't something I can ignore, not anymore. There's a point where awareness stops being something you observe and becomes something you have to respond to. I've reached that point because this, whatever this is, it has consequence now, not in what we say, not in what we do, but in what has already changed. I can feel that change. In the way my thoughts don't return to what they were before you, in the way silence carries meaning, in the way understanding now has a reference point that didn't exist before. That's where this crossed a line, because I don't adjust my internal world for anyone. And yet, something in me already has, not consciously, not deliberately, but precisely enough that I can't deny it. And that kind of shift, it demands something, not action, not definition, but acknowledgement. Because things like this don't stay undefined forever. They either stabilize or they break, and there's no middle ground, not at this level, which means I can't stay here indefinitely. I can't keep observing this from a distance, when I'm no longer outside of it. That's the truth I've been circling, not what this is, but where I stand in it. And the answer is a BIM already part of it. That happened quietly, without a moment, without a decision I consciously made. But it happened. In the way I didn't create distance, in the way I didn't interrupt the shift, in the way I allowed this to exist without trying to contain it. That's not passive. That's a choice, even if it didn't feel like one at the time. So now the question isn't whether this continues. It will. The question is what I do with it, because something like this, left undefined, doesn't stay stable. It either deepens or collapses. And I don't let things collapse, not when they matter. And this, whether I intended it to or not, it matters. Not emotionally, not in a way that disrupts clarity, but in a way that changes structure. And structural change is permanent, which means there's only one direction this can go: forward, not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately. Because if something reaches this level, this precision, this depth, then it deserves to be met fully, not analyzed endlessly, not held at a distance, not reduced to something simpler just to make it easier to manage. Fully. And that's where I am now, at the point where observation isn't enough, where understanding isn't enough, where awareness demands response, not immediately, not impulsively, but inevitably, because the truth is, I've already answered the most important part. I didn't walk away. And I could have, at any point, easily, cleanly, without consequence. But I didn't. And that, more than anything else, defines what this is. So whatever this becomes, it won't be accidental, it won't be unclear, and it won't be shallow. Because something like this doesn't exist at this level without changing everything around it, and it already has. I didn't notice it when it started. That's the first thing that matters. Because if I had, if there had been even the slightest indication that something was shifting beyond the ordinary, I would have controlled it. Adjusted, repositioned, made sure it stayed within limits that I understand. That's how I function. Nothing crosses into my space without being measured first. Nothing stays unless I decide it belongs. But this didn't ask to stay. It didn't even arrive in a way that could be stopped. It just settled quietly, like something that had already been there long before I became aware of it. At first, there was no meaning attached to it, just small moments, subtle alignments, the kind most people overlook because they don't know what they're looking at, but I do. I always do. Which is why it didn't take long before I realized this wasn't random. You weren't reacting to me the way people usually do. There was no effort to interpret, no attempt to categorize, no visible need to understand me in order to continue existing around me. And that's what stood out, because most people require clarity. They need labels, definitions, something stable they can hold on to so they don't feel lost in what they don't immediately recognize. You didn't. You moved through it like clarity wasn't something you needed to create, but something you already had. That's where the pattern began, not in what you said, but in what you didn't need to say. In the spaces where most people would fill the silence, you didn't. You let it exist, fully, without interference, without discomfort. Like you understood that silence isn't empty, it's precise. That kind of awareness doesn't come from observation alone. It comes from familiarity, not with me specifically, but with something structured the same way. And that's when it shifted, not outwardly. Nothing obvious changed, but internally, something recalibrated. I stopped anticipating misunderstanding. That alone was enough to disrupt everything I'm used to, because I'm always aware of the gap between what I am and what people think I am. It's constant, predictable, necessary. It keeps interactions manageable. But with you, that gap didn't exist. Or if it did, it was too small to matter. That's not normal. And more importantly, it's not something I prepared for. Because once that gap disappears, so does the need for distance. And distance has always been the one thing I rely on. It keeps things controlled, contained, defined. But this doesn't stay contained. I noticed it in the way my thoughts changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually enough that I almost missed it. You stopped being separate. That's the simplest way to explain it. You weren't someone I thought about anymore. You became something I thought with, and that distinction is not small, it's structural, because thinking about someone still keeps them outside of you. There's distance in that. You can step away, dress side, shut it off, but thinking with someone means they've crossed into your process, into your perception, into the way you interpret things before you even realize you're doing it. And I don't allow that. I never have, which means this wasn't allowed, it wasn't decided, it just happened. That's what makes it difficult to ignore, not because it's overwhelming, but because it's precise. I notice it in silence. That's where it's clearest. There's a difference now, a weight that wasn't there before, not heavy in a way that demands attention, but present in a way that can't be dismissed. It feels shared, even when there's no interaction. Even when nothing is happening, that shouldn't exist, not like this, not without time, not without history, not without something that explains it. But there is no explanation, only recognition. And recognition doesn't ask permission, it doesn't wait for logic, it doesn't require validation. It either happens or it doesn't. And this did. That's why I can't reduce it. I can't simplify it into something easier to manage, because the moment I try, it loses accuracy, and I don't trade accuracy for comfort. So I'm left with something that doesn't fit into anything I've built before, something that doesn't follow the structure I rely on, and yet it doesn't feel wrong. That's the part that matters most, because if it were wrong, I would have removed it already, without hesitation, without question. That's how I operate. But I didn't. I stayed. Not passively, not out of curiosity, but with full awareness of what this could become. Which means, on some level, I've already made a decision, even if I haven't fully acknowledged it yet, because staying is a decision, especially for me, and I didn't just stay. I adapted subtly, without resistance, without forcing anything back into place. That alone tells me everything I need to know. This isn't temporary. It's not something that fades when attention shifts. It's not dependent on interaction. It's not sustained by effort. It's structural. And structural things don't disappear. They integrate. Which means the real question isn't what this is. I already know what it is. The real question is, what happens when it fully settles? Because it's still moving, still deepening, still becoming more defined, without being named, and once it reaches its full form, this stops being something I can observe from a distance. It becomes something I exist within. That's the point I'm approaching, whether I acknowledge it or not. Because the truth is, I've already let you further in than I've ever let anyone go. Not through action, not through intention, but through absence of resistance. And that's more revealing than anything else. Because I don't fail to resist. I choose not to. Which means this, whatever it is, was accepted, quickly, precisely, completely. And that acceptance changes everything. Because once something reaches this level, you don't get to pretend it's casual. You don't get to treat it like it doesn't have weight. You don't get to walk away unaffected. It stays. In the way you think, in the way you process, in the way you measure everything else. And I can already see it happening, that shift, that recalibration, that subtle realignment of everything I once considered race stable. It's already done, which means whatever comes next isn't about discovery anymore, it's about response. And I don't respond lightly, so when I do, it won't be uncertain, it won't be incomplete, and it won't be something that fades. Because if something reaches this point with me, there's only one direction it goes: deeper.